He was absolutely sure that his wife was completely helpless in court. Sitting comfortably in his chair, leaning back with confidence, he watched her stand alone in front of the judge. No lawyer beside her, no family member behind her, no visible support of any kind. Just her and her silence. A faint smile rested on his face, the kind of smile that appears when someone believes the outcome is already decided. He leaned slightly toward his attorney and whispered, "Look at her. She has nothing." The lawyer nodded quietly. Around the courtroom, many people seemed to agree. She looked calm. Too calm. And calm in a courtroom is often mistaken for weakness. But what no one in that room understood yet was that this was only the beginning. This wasn't just a divorce case. This was a decision about a woman's entire life, her dignity, her patience, her truth. And the most confident person in the room was her husband. He truly believed his wife had nothing to say. No money, no power, no voice. The judge called the hearing to order. Allegations came from the husband's side. She was financially dependent. She made emotional decisions. She contributed nothing to this marriage. Every sentence was delivered with confidence, as if the conclusion had already been written. With each accusation, the husband leaned back even more comfortably in his seat. To him, every word sounded like confirmation. His wife remained silent. And once again, the courtroom mistook silence for defeat. Before we continue, if you enjoy real courtroom stories, emotional cases where the truth slowly comes to light, and moments where wrong assumptions collapse, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the bell icon so that every upcoming video reaches you first. Because these stories aren't just told, they are felt. The judge finally turned toward her. "Would you like to present your defense?" A quiet murmur spread through the room. Will she even speak? Does she understand the law? This case is already over. Her husband didn't even bother to look at her. He smiled and muttered, "Let's see what drama happens now." She took a deep breath. Then she stood. Her hands were empty, no files, no documents. And that's when a few people laughed. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. Her voice wasn't raised when she began to speak, but it was clear. "I'm not here to beg for sympathy," she said. "I'm here to speak the truth." The courtroom slowly grew quiet. Her husband's smile faded. "Just a little," she continued. "I've been called weak. I've been described as dependent. I've been portrayed as powerless." She paused and looked directly at her husband. "But what hasn't been mentioned," she said calmly, "is that my silence was never my weakness." The judge sat up straighter. The atmosphere began to shift. But her husband still believed it didn't matter. Words, he thought, were not proof. She finished speaking and sat down. The judge began to move on to the next step of the hearing. And then, the courtroom door opened, slowly. Every head turned. An elderly woman stepped inside. White hair, straight posture, eyes filled with certainty. The wife turned around. For the first time that day, emotion appeared in her eyes. It was her mother. Her husband's expression changed instantly. He hadn't expected this. Not today, not at all. And what he didn't yet realize was that the moment her mother entered the courtroom, nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom froze. No one expected the interruption. Not the judge, not the lawyers, and certainly not the husband. The elderly woman stood near the doorway for a moment, scanning the room. Her presence alone carried weight, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't rush, she didn't speak. She simply walked forward. The wife remained seated, her hands slowly tightening together. She hadn't planned this. Not today. Not like this. Her husband turned fully in his chair now. The confidence he had worn so easily just moments ago was gone. His smile had vanished, replaced by confusion, and something close to unease. "Who is that?" he whispered sharply to his lawyer. The lawyer didn't answer right away. The judge raised a hand. "Ma'am," he said firmly but respectfully, "this is an active hearing." The woman stopped a few steps from the front. "I know," she said calmly. Her voice was steady, clear. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." The courtroom listened. "I'm her mother," she continued, nodding slightly toward her daughter. and I believe this court is about to hear only half the truth." A murmur spread through the room. The husband's jaw tightened. The judge looked at the clerk, then back at the woman. "This hearing did not list you as a witness," he said. "I understand," she replied, "but I was asked not to come. That sentence changed everything." The judge leaned forward. "Asked by whom?" he asked. The woman's eyes didn't move as she answered. "By him." She looked directly at her son-in-law. The courtroom went silent. The husband stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate." "Sit down," the judge said sharply. The husband froze, then slowly sat. The judge turned back to the woman. "Why were you asked not to attend?" he asked. The woman took a breath. "Because I was there when things began," she said, "and I was there when my daughter stopped being herself." The wife closed her eyes briefly. The judge glanced toward her. "Mrs.," he said gently, "did you know your mother was coming today?" She shook her head. "No," she said quietly, "I didn't." The judge nodded once. "Continue," he said to the mother. The woman's voice never shook. "When my daughter got married, she said she was independent, strong, working, confident." She paused. Slowly that changed. The husband shifted in his seat. "She stopped calling as often," the woman continued. "Stopped visiting. Stopped making decisions without checking first." She looked around the courtroom. "You were told she was dependent," she said, "but no one asked how she became that way." The judge listened intently. "Over the years," the woman said, "I watched her give up pieces of herself to keep the peace." The husband's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is emotional testimony, not evidence." The judge didn't look at him. "Sit," he said simply. The lawyer sat. The mother continued. "There were nights she called me crying," she said, "but she always asked me not to come, not to interfere." She swallowed, and I respected that. The wife's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I stayed away because I was told it would make things worse," the mother said, "that my presence would embarrass him." She paused and looked directly at the husband. "So I stayed away." The courtroom felt heavier now. The judge turned to the wife. "Is this accurate?" he asked. The wife nodded. "Yes." Her husband shook his head slightly. "This is manipulation," he muttered. The judge looked at him sharply. "You've spoken enough," he said. The mother took one step forward. "I'm not here to accuse," she said. "I'm here to explain." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. "I kept these," she said, "not for court, for fear." She handed them to the clerk. The judge reviewed contents, messages, dates, notes. The husband's lawyer leaned in to look. His expression changed. The judge raised his eyes. "These documents suggest long-term control and isolation," he said slowly. The husband's face went pale. The judge turned to the wife. "Why didn't you bring this forward earlier?" he asked. She answered honestly. "Because I didn't want my mother involved," she said. "I didn't want her hurt." The judge nodded. "That answers more than you think." He turned to the courtroom. "This hearing will be paused," he said. "I will review this material fully." The husband stood again. "Your Honor, this is turning into a spectacle." "No," the judge interrupted. "This is turning into clarity." The room went silent. The judge looked directly at the husband. "You believed your wife was helpless," he said. "You believed she stood alone." He glanced toward the mother. "You were wrong." The wife finally looked at her husband. Not with anger, not with fear, with resolve. And for the first time since the hearing began, he looked uncertain. The courtroom felt different after the recess. He noticed it the moment everyone returned to their seats. The whispers were gone. The casual expressions had disappeared. Even the air felt heavier. Her mother sat quietly behind her now, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had already shifted the balance. The husband sat stiffly beside his lawyer. Our confidence was gone, replaced by irritation he couldn't hide. He kept glancing toward the folder the judge had taken with him during the break. The judge entered and took his seat. Everyone stood, then sat. "This hearing will continue," the judge said calmly. "And before we proceed, I want to make something clear." He looked directly at the husband. "This court is not interested in performances. We are interested in patterns." The husband swallowed. The judge turned toward the clerk. Please bring the documents forward. The folder was placed on the desk. These records, the judge continued, include messages, timelines, and personal notes spanning several years. He looked up. They raised serious questions. The husband's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, with respect, these materials were not formally submitted earlier, because they were never meant to be, the judge interrupted. That doesn't make them irrelevant. The lawyer sat. The judge turned toward the wife. Mrs., he said, your mother mentioned isolation. He paused. Can you explain that in your own words? She stood slowly. I didn't notice it at first, she said. It didn't feel like control. She took a breath. It felt like adjustment. The courtroom listened. Small things, she continued. Who I talked to, when I visited, what I shared. She glanced briefly at her mother, then back at the judge. He said it was about privacy, she said, about keeping our marriage strong. The husband shook his head. That's not true, he muttered. The judge looked at him sharply. You'll have your turn, he said. She continued. I stopped telling my mother everything, she said. Not because I didn't trust her. She paused, but because I was told she didn't need to know. The judge nodded slowly. And over time, he asked. Over time, she said, I stopped deciding anything without asking. The courtroom remained silent. The judge turned toward the husband. Is this accurate? He asked. The husband leaned forward. Your Honor, he said, this is being exaggerated. Every marriage has boundaries. The judge held his gaze. Boundaries don't require silence, he replied. The husband looked away. The judge flipped through the documents. There are messages here, he said, where you discouraged outside contact. He read aloud. It's better if we keep this between us. The husband's lawyer shifted in his seat. That could mean many things, the lawyer said. It could, the judge replied. But repetition gives meaning. He turned to the mother. Ma'am, he said, you mentioned your daughter changed. Yes, she replied. How? The judge asked. She stopped trusting her own instincts, the mother said. She apologized for things she didn't do. Her voice stayed calm. She became smaller. The wife lowered her eyes. The husband stood abruptly. This is character assassination, he said. She's turning personal disagreements into, accusations. The judge didn't raise his voice. Sit down, he said. The husband hesitated, then sat. The judge turned back to the wife. You were described earlier as financially dependent, he said. Did you ever have access to marital finances? She nodded. At first, she said. Later, it became complicated. In what way? The judge asked. I needed approval, she said quietly, even for basic things. The courtroom reacted, not with sound, but with movement. People leaned forward. The judge turned another page. These notes mention fear, he said. He looked at her. Fear of what? She hesitated. Of consequences, she said. The judge nodded once. That explains silence, he said. The husband clenched his jaw. The judge addressed the room. This court does not equate quiet with consent, he said. He looked directly at the husband. Nor does it equate confidence with truth. The husband's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, this hearing is moving beyond divorce into allegations. Into context, the judge corrected. He turned to the wife's mother. You were asked not to attend, he said. Why did you come anyway? The woman answered simply, because my daughter stopped protecting herself. The courtroom absorbed that. The judge closed the folder. This court will continue to examine these patterns, he said. Not to punish, but to understand. He looked at the husband. You believed your wife was powerless, he said. You believed she owed alone. He glanced briefly at the mother. That belief was incorrect. The wife sat back down. Her hands were steady now. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was explaining herself. She felt like she was being heard. The husband stared straight ahead. The story he had relied on was slipping away, and he knew it. The judge called for a short pause. But this time it wasn't a routine break. It was the kind of pause that tells everyone in the room that something important has shifted. When the hearing resumed, the courtroom no longer felt neutral. It felt alert. The husband noticed it immediately. People weren't looking at his wife anymore. They were looking at him. He sat stiffly, his shoulders tense, his hands clasped together. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering urgently, flipping through notes that suddenly felt less convincing. Her mother remained seated behind her daughter, calm and still. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything she had already said was echoing through the room. The judge returned to his seat and adjusted his glasses. "This court has reviewed the documents submitted," he said evenly, "and I want to be clear about something before we continue." He looked directly at the husband. "This is not about assigning blame for a failed marriage." The husband nodded quickly as if relieved. "This is about understanding control," the judge continued. The relief vanished. The judge turned a page. "These messages show repeated discouragement of outside contact," he said. "Not once, not twice, but over several years." The husband's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, many couples choose privacy. Privacy is mutual," the judge interrupted. "Isolation is not." The lawyer sat back down. The judge turned to the wife. "Mrs.," he said gently, "you were described earlier as dependent and passive." She nodded slightly. "Did you see yourself that way?" She took a moment before answering. "No," she said. "Not at first." The courtroom listened closely. "At first," she continued, "I thought I was being supportive. I thought I was helping my marriage." She paused. "But over time, I stopped recognizing myself." The judge leaned forward. "In what way?" he asked. "I stopped trusting my decisions," she said. "I stopped reaching out. I stopped believing my discomfort mattered." Her husband shook his head in frustration. "That's not fair," he muttered. The judge looked at him sharply. "You will not interrupt," he said. The husband fell silent. The wife continued. "When I stayed quiet," she said, "it wasn't because I agreed." She looked around the courtroom. It was because speaking felt risky. The judge nodded slowly. "That distinction matters," he said. He turned to the husband. "Mister," he said, "you claimed earlier that your wife lacked independence." "Yes," the husband replied quickly. "She relied on me for everything." The judge raised an eyebrow. "For permission," he corrected. The room reacted. "That's not what I meant," the husband said. "It's what the record shows," the judge replied calmly. He held up a document. "Multiple instances of approval required for routine decisions," he said. "Financial, social, and personal." The husband's lawyer whispered urgently again. The judge turned to the mother. "Ma'am," he said, "when did you realize something was wrong?" She answered without hesitation. "When my daughter stopped laughing," she said. The room went quiet. "She used to call me excited about small things," the mother continued. "Then the calls became careful." She paused. She started asking if she was overreacting. The wife looked down. "That's when I knew," the mother said. The judge nodded once. "Thank you," he said. He turned back to the wife. "Did you feel safe expressing disagreement in your marriage?" he asked. The wife hesitated, then shook her head. "Not anymore," she said. The husband stood abruptly. "This is being twisted," he said angrily. "She's rewriting history." The judge didn't raise his voice. "Sit," he said firmly. The husband hesitated, then sat. The judge looked directly at him. "You believed your wife was powerless," he said, "but what I see is someone who learned silence." He turned to the courtroom. "This court recognizes that silence can be a survival response." The husband's face tightened. The judge flipped another page. "There are also records here," he said, "of financial rest. Friction following disagreements." The husband looked shocked. "That's not—" The judge raised a hand. "Enough," he said. The judge turned back to the wife. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" he asked gently. She answered honestly. "Because I was afraid," she said, "and because I didn't want to prove him right." The judge nodded. "That fear explains more than any argument," he said. He leaned back in his chair. "This court will not ignore long-term patterns of emotional control simply because they weren't labeled at the time." The courtroom absorbed his words. The judge concluded, "This hearing will continue with a full reassessment of marital dynamics and power balance." He paused. "And no assumptions will be carried forward." The husband stared straight ahead. The version of the case he had relied on was unraveling. Slowly, publicly, irreversibly. The wife sat quietly, her hands steady now. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was defending herself. She felt like the truth was doing the work for her. The courtroom had crossed a line it could not return from. This was no longer about who was right or wrong in a marriage. It was about what had been hidden in plain sight. The husband felt it. He sat rigidly in his chair, jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead. His lawyer no longer whispered strategies. There were no quick fixes left to suggest. The judge leaned back slightly, hands folded. "This court has heard extensive testimony," he said. "Not just about actions, but about patterns." He looked directly at the husband. "Patterns don't happen overnight," the judge continued. "They are built slowly, often quietly." The husband shifted. "Your Honor," he said, trying to steady his voice, "this is being framed unfairly. I never forced her to do anything." The judge held his gaze. "Force does not always involve commands," he replied. "Sometimes it involves consequences." The courtroom went still. The judge turned toward the wife. "Mrs., he said gently, "earlier you mentioned fear." She nodded. "Fear of what?" he asked. She took a breath. "Fear of conflict," she said. "Fear of being told I was ungrateful. Fear of being made to feel like I was the problem." Her husband scoffed softly. The judge looked at him. "Do you dispute that she felt this way?" he asked. The husband hesitated. "I never meant." "Intent is not impact," the judge said calmly. The husband fell silent. The judge turned to the documents again. "These records," he said, "show a shift in control following disagreements." He read aloud. "After disputes, access to finances restricted, social plans cancelled, communication reduced." The husband's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, disagreements happen in all marriages." "Yes," the judge replied, "but punishment is not compromise." The lawyer sat. The judge turned toward the wife's mother. "Ma'am," he said, "you described your daughter becoming withdrawn." "Yes," she replied. She stopped. "Trusting herself." The judge nodded. "That is often the most damaging outcome," he said. He turned back to the wife. "When did you realize something was wrong?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "When I started explaining my feelings instead of expressing them," she said. The courtroom listened carefully. "I would rehearse conversations in my head," she continued. "I would choose silence because it felt safer." The husband shook his head. "That's not control," he muttered. The judge looked at him. "Silence chosen out of fear is not peace," he said. The husband's face tightened. The judge leaned forward. "This court must consider power dynamics," he said, "and power is not always loud." He paused. "Sometimes it looks like confidence." The husband swallowed. The judge continued. "Earlier you described your wife as dependent," he said. "But dependency often develops, not appears." He looked at the wife. "Did you feel capable before this marriage?" he asked. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "Did that change?" the judge asked. "Yes," she said quietly. The courtroom absorbed the simplicity of her answers. The judge turned toward the jury. "You were initially presented with a narrative of weakness," he said. "You are now seeing the context that created it." The husband's lawyer stood again. "Your Honor, this case risks moving into moral judgment." "This court is not judging morality," the judge replied. "It is examining reality." He turned CK to the husband. "You believed your wife was helpless," he said, "but what I see is someone who adapted." The husband clenched his fists. "Adaptation," the judge continued, "is not consent." The wife's mother closed her eyes briefly. The judge flipped to another page. "There are also records here," he said, "where reconciliation followed withdrawal of support." The husband's face went pale. "That's taken out of context," he said. "Context is precisely what we are examining," the judge replied. The judge looked at the wife again. "Why did you stay?" he asked gently. She answered honestly. "Because leaving felt like failure," she said, "and because I was told no one else would understand." The judge nodded slowly. "That belief," he said, "keeps many people silent." He leaned back in his chair. "This court recognizes that control does not always appear abusive to outsiders," he said. "But its effects are cumulative." The room was silent. The judge concluded. "This hearing will proceed toward a final determination," he said. taking into account emotional dynamics, financial control, and long-term impact. He paused, then added, and the assumption that one party stood alone has been thoroughly challenged. The husband stared straight ahead. The story he had relied on was gone. The wife sat quietly, her hands steady. She wasn't pleading anymore. She wasn't explaining anymore. The truth was now fully in the room, and it was no longer hers to carry out. 1. By the time the court reconvened, everyone understood one thing. This case was no longer about appearances. It was about consequences. The husband sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. The confident posture he once carried was gone. His lawyer leaned closer than before, whispering cautiously, choosing words carefully now, not to win but to minimize damage. The wife sat upright, calm, present. Her mother remained behind her, silent and composed, her hands folded. She had said everything that needed to be said. The judge entered and took his seat. "This court has reviewed the testimony and documentation presented," he began. "What remains now is accountability." The word hung in the air. The judge looked directly at the husband. "Mr. he said, "you repeatedly described your wife as weak and dependent." The husband nodded stiffly. "But the evidence shows something different," the judge continued. "It shows a gradual transfer of decision-making power." He paused. "That is not accidental." The husband leaned forward. "Your Honor," he said, "I never stopped her from doing anything." The judge met his eyes. "Control does not require prohibition," he replied. "It requires consequence." The courtroom remained silent. The judge turned toward the wife. "Mrs. he said gently, "earlier you mentioned that your silence was intentional." She nodded. "Yes," she said, "because speaking always made things worse." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Slightly. In what way?" he asked. She took a breath. "If I disagreed," she said, "support would be withdrawn." She paused. Not loudly, not immediately. Her voice stayed steady, but enough for me to notice. The husband's lawyer shifted in his seat. The judge nodded. "That aligns with the records," he said. He turned a page, periods of disagreement followed by emotional distance, financial restriction, or dismissal. The husband shook his head. "That's not punishment," he said. "That's space." The judge looked at him carefully. "Space that only moves in one direction," he replied. The room reacted. The judge turned toward the jury. "You have heard testimony suggesting helplessness," he said. "You have now seen evidence of adaptation." He paused. "Adaptation is not consent. It is survival." The wife's shoulders relaxed slightly. The judge continued. "This court recognizes that power does not always announce itself," he said. "Sometimes it hides behind reason." He turned back to the husband. "You believed your wife stood alone," he said. "That belief allowed you to underestimate her." The husband looked down. The judge turned toward the mother. "Ma'am," he said, "you described stepping back at your daughter's request." "Yes," she replied. "Why?" the judge asked. "Because she was afraid I would make things worse," the mother said, "and because she was protecting him." The courtroom absorbed that. The judge nodded. "That protection," he said, "came at a cost." He turned back to the wife. "What changed?" he asked. She answered quietly. "When I realized my silence was teaching him that I would always adapt," she said. The judge nodded. "That realization often marks the end of imbalance," he said. The husband's lawyer stood one final time. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "we acknowledge mistakes, but this is still a divorce proceeding." "Yes," the judge replied. "And divorce proceedings examine the truth of the relationship." He leaned back. "This court will not dismiss long-term emotional control simply because it was subtle." The judge looked directly at the husband. "You underestimated your wife," he said. "You believed she was powerless." The husband didn't respond, the judge continued. "You believed she needed you to speak for her." He paused. She did not. The courtroom felt still, not tense, but resolved. The judge addressed the room. "This hearing will move toward final ruling," he said, "based on documented patterns, credible testimony, and the presence of long-term imbalance." He paused again, and based on the understanding that silence does not equal consent. The wife closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, in release. The judge concluded, We will reconvene for the final decision." The gavel sounded softly. The husband remained seated long after others began to move. The story he believed, the one where his wife stood alone and defeated, had fully collapsed. The why? Faye stood slowly. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. For the first time, she felt something solid beneath her feet. Not anger. Not victory. Ground. The courtroom was quiet when everyone returned for the final time. Not the tense quiet from before. Not the uncertain kind. This was the quiet that comes when the truth has already settled. The husband sat still, eyes fixed forward. His lawyer said nothing now. There were no notes left to flip through, no angles left to explore. The story they had brought into the room had been examined from every side, and it no longer held. The wife sat upright, hands resting calmly on the table. Her mother sat behind her, steady and silent. She had done what she came to do. Nothing more was needed. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat. He looked down at his papers one last time, then placed them neatly to the side. "This court has considered all testimony, documentation, and context presented," he said. "Not just what happened, but how it happened." He paused. "This case did not begin with cruelty," he continued. "It began with imbalance." The husband lifted his head slightly. "Imbalance," the judge said, "that grew quietly over time." He turned toward the wife. "Mrs.," he said, "you were described as dependent, passive, helpless." The wife met his gaze. "But what this court has seen," the judge continued, "is not helplessness." He paused. "It is endurance." The courtroom listened without a sound. "You adapted," the judge said. "You adjusted. You learned silence not because you agreed, but because it kept the peace." He turned toward the husband. "That peace," he said, "came at her expense." The husband's jaw tightened. The judge leaned forward slightly. "This court recognizes that control does not always appear as force," he said. "Sometimes it appears as confidence." He paused again. "And confidence, unchecked, becomes authority." The judge turned to the mother. "Ma'am," he said, "your presence today provided context." She nodded once. "You were asked not to come," the judge continued. "And yet, when you did, clarity followed." The courtroom remained still. The judge looked back at the wife. "You stood here without a lawyer," he said. "Not because you lacked support, but because you trusted the truth." The wife didn't smile. She didn't need to. The judge straightened. "This court finds that the marital dynamics presented here demonstrate long-term emotional imbalance and financial restriction." The husband exhaled sharply. "The court further finds," the judge continued, "that Mrs. did not lack capability." He paused. "She lacked safety." The words landed heavily. "Therefore," the judge said, "this court rules that the dissolution of this marriage must reflect fairness, not dominance." The husband's lawyer lowered his eyes. "The division of assets will consider years of unpaid labor, emotional restraint, and documented isolation." The judge said. He looked directly at the husband. "You believed your wife was powerless," he said. "You believed she stood alone." He paused. "You were wrong." The courtroom absorbed the moment. "This ruling is final," the judge said. The gavel struck once. It was over. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then chairs shifted. Quiet breaths were released. The husband remained seated, staring at the table. The confidence he once carried was gone, not shattered but emptied. The wife stood. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She turned slightly, just enough to look at her mother. Their eyes met. Nothing was said. Everything had already been understood. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, not lighter, clearer. Someone asked her how she felt. She paused. "I feel like myself again," she said. And that was all. She walked forward, not victorious, not bitter, just free,